Bizarre Law Files. Episode 3, When Clothing Was Controlled by Law. In 1337, the King of England issued a formal legal proclamation. It did not concern war. It did not concern taxation. It did not concern the rights of the nobility or the duties of the church. It concerned fabric. Specifically, it concerned who was allowed to wear it. The proclamation established, in precise and legally binding terms, exactly which materials, which colors, and which garments each rank of English society was permitted to put on their body. It specified the maximum value of fur that a farmer could wear. It listed the exact types of cloth that a knight's wife could dress in, and the exact types she could not. It determined by law that certain colors belonged to certain people, and that wearing the wrong color was not a fashion choice. It was a crime. This was not an isolated act of royal eccentricity. It was one of dozens of similar laws passed across England, France, Italy, Japan, and the Byzantine Empire over a period of more than 1,000 years. Laws that reached into the wardrobes of every citizen, from the highest nobleman to the lowest laborer, and told them exactly what they were allowed to wear. The laws were called sumptuary laws, and they were enforced, not occasionally, not selectively as a tool of political persecution against specific enemies, enforced as routine legal procedure, with fines, with confiscation, with public humiliation, and in some times and places, with consequences considerably worse than embarrassment. For more than 1,000 years, across cultures that shared almost nothing else in common, the law agreed on one thing. What you wore was not your private decision. It belonged to the state, the law that dressed the world. The word sumptuary comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expenditure or cost. Sumptuary laws were, at their core, laws about spending. Specifically, laws designed to control what people spent their money on and what that spending communicated to the world around them. To understand why governments believed they had both the right and the obligation to legislate clothing, you have to understand what clothing meant in the pre-modern world. Today, clothing is primarily personal. What you wear communicates your taste, your mood, your cultural identity. It signals group membership, aspiration, individuality. It is an expression of self. In the medieval and early modern world, clothing was not personal. It was positional. What you wore was not an expression of who you were inside. It was a declaration of where you stood in the social order, and that declaration was not yours to make unilaterally. The hierarchy of medieval society was not merely a political arrangement. It was understood as a divinely ordained structure. God had placed kings above nobles, nobles above merchants, merchants above craftsmen, craftsmen above laborers. Each position in that structure carried specific rights, specific duties, and specific visible markers that the community could read at a glance. Clothing was one of the most important of those markers. When a nobleman walked through a market wearing ermine fur and crimson silk, everyone around him immediately understood his position. They knew how to address him, how to defer to him, what obligations they had toward him, and he toward them. The clothing was information. Social, legal, moral information that kept the structure functioning. When a wealthy merchant began wearing the same ermine fur and the same crimson silk, which he could now afford because trade had made him rich, that information became noise. The signal was corrupted. The structure wobbled. Sumptuary laws were the government's attempt to protect the signal. They were not fundamentally about fashion. They were about legibility, about ensuring that when you looked at a person, you could read their place in the world accurately and immediately. And that reading was considered so important to the functioning of society that the state was willing to prosecute you for getting dressed incorrectly. The laws appeared across every major civilization that developed a formal social hierarchy. Ancient Rome, medieval England, Renaissance Italy, feudal Japan, the Ottoman Empire, each one with its own specific rules, its own enforcement mechanisms, its own particular obsessions. We will examine 3 of them. And we will begin with color. Case 1, the color that could get you killed. Purple is the color most associated with royalty in Western history, and that association did not begin as tradition or preference. It began as law, and in its earliest and most extreme form, wearing purple without authorization was not a fashion violation. It was a capital offense. Before we examine the fabric laws and the enforcement problems and the creative evasions that eventually undermined them, we need to understand exactly how serious the color laws were at their most extreme. Because at their most extreme, they were a matter of life and death. The story of purple begins not in a palace, but in a tidal pool. Tyrian purple, the specific shade that became the most coveted and controlled color in the ancient world, was produced from the secretions of a sea snail called Murex brandaris, found in the waters of the eastern Mediterranean near the city of Tyre. The process of extracting the dye was slow, labor-intensive, and extraordinarily expensive. Each snail produced only a tiny amount of the relevant fluid. To dye a single pound of cloth a deep, rich purple required tens of thousands of snails. The smell of the dye-making process was, by all historical accounts, profoundly unpleasant. The workshops that produced Tyrian purple were required by several ancient cities to operate outside the city walls because the odor was considered intolerable. The result was a color that was beautiful, permanent, and almost impossibly costly. And because it was costly, it became a status symbol. And because it became a status symbol, it attracted legislation. In ancient Rome, the regulation of purple began informally, with social convention, and hardened over time into explicit law. Julius Caesar is recorded as wearing a purple toga exclusively and restricting its public use to himself. The emperors who followed him codified this restriction. By the time of the later Roman Empire, wearing purple dyed with Tyrian purple was formally restricted to the emperor alone. Senators could wear a purple stripe on their toga. Generals could be awarded the right to wear a purple cloak for a specific occasion. But the full purple garment, the true imperial purple, belonged to one person. The Byzantine Empire, which continued the traditions of Rome, intensified this restriction to a degree that is difficult to overstate. Byzantine emperors did not merely restrict the wearing of purple, they controlled the entire infrastructure of its production. Imperial workshops produced purple cloth exclusively for the court. Private production was illegal. Smuggling purple dye or purple cloth out of the empire was treated as a form of treason. The emperor's children were referred to as porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, because the birthing chambers of the imperial palace were lined with porphyry stone, which is naturally purple, specifically to ensure that heirs to the throne entered the world surrounded by the imperial color. Purple was not a preference, it was a sovereign property, and the consequences of treating it otherwise were severe. Several Byzantine sources document cases in which individuals were executed for wearing unauthorized purple garments. The offense was categorized not as a fashion violation, but as an act of political presumption, an implicit claim to imperial authority. To wear the emperor's color was to announce, however unintentionally, that you considered yourself the emperor's equal or successor. In a political system where imperial succession was frequently violent, that announcement was not taken lightly. The color you wore could, in the Byzantine Empire at its most paranoid moments, be read as a declaration of intent. And the court responded accordingly. And this sovereign control of color spread in modified form across medieval Europe. English sumptuary laws of the 14th and 15th centuries specified exactly which shades of which colors were permitted to each rank. Crimson silk was restricted to dukes and higher. Deep scarlet was restricted to knights and above. Certain combinations of color, gold thread on red cloth, for instance, were reserved for the royal household. The reasoning was identical to the Roman system. Color communicated rank, and rank was the architecture the society ran on. Corrupting that communication was not a private act, it was a public offense. One English statute from 1363 specifies that no knight under the rank of lord may wear cloth of gold. It then specifies, with equal precision, that a yeoman's wife may not wear a veil worth more than 12 pence. These were not guidelines, they were statutes with penalties attached. Because when color is information, wearing the wrong one is a lie the whole society has to live inside. The economics behind the aesthetics. It would be simple and wrong to understand sumptuary laws purely as vanity legislation, as powerful people protecting their visual exclusivity from the newly wealthy. The economic dimension was equally important, and in some cases more important. Medieval European economies were deeply vulnerable to what we would now call trade imbalances. The most desirable luxury fabrics, silk, Fine linen, velvet, expensive dyed wool were produced in specific regions and traded across vast distances. When English merchants bought Italian silk or Flemish cloth, money left the English economy and did not return. This concerned English governments intensely. Several English sumptuary laws were drafted explicitly as economic interventions. By restricting the consumption of imported luxury fabrics, the government hoped to keep money circulating domestically, support English textile production, and reduce the outflow of currency to foreign producers. The 1337 proclamation of Edward III, the one this episode opened with, was partly a response to the English wool trade and the desire to protect domestic textile production from competition with imported cloth. By legally restricting who could wear foreign fabric, the government was attempting to shape the market. This economic dimension also explains why the laws tracked so precisely with income as well as rank. English sumptuary laws did not merely specify what a duke could wear versus what a baron could wear. They specified what someone earning £40 a year could wear versus what someone earning £100 a year could wear. The law was managing consumption. It was telling the population not merely what was socially appropriate for their position, but what the economy needed them to buy and not buy. When you understand this, the lists of fabric restrictions, which read to the modern eye like extraordinarily fussy clothing catalogs, begin to look more like monetary policy. They just happen to be written in the language of silk. Case 2, the fabric wars of Tudor England. England between 1337 and 1604 passed more than 30 distinct pieces of sumptuary legislation. 30 separate statutes, each one adjusting the rules, tightening them in some areas, relaxing them in others, adding new categories of restricted goods, specifying new penalties for violations. 30 statutes over 267 years. The sheer volume of legislation tells you something important. It tells you the laws were not working. When a law is working, you do not need to rewrite it every decade. You rewrite a law when the behavior it is designed to prevent keeps happening anyway. The behavior that English sumptuary legislation could not stop was simple. People kept wearing what they wanted to wear. The enforcement problem was fundamental. England in the 14th and 15th centuries had no police force, no inspectors, no dedicated mechanism for identifying and prosecuting clothing violations. Enforcement was theoretically the responsibility of local officials, sheriffs, justices of the peace. But clothing violations were low on their list of priorities compared to actual crime, tax collection, and the management of a society that was periodically devastated by plague. The result was a body of law that was widely known, regularly discussed, frequently reissued, and largely ignored. Henry VIII, who had strong views on many things, issued sumptuary proclamations with particular enthusiasm. His regulations specified not merely what fabric and color each rank could wear, but the precise cut of certain garments, the maximum length of a gentleman's cloak, and the permissible depth of embroidery on a courtier's doublet. The documentation of violations from the Henry VIII period shows a persistent pattern. Wealthy merchants and minor gentry were regularly observed wearing fabrics and colors above their legal station. The penalties specified in the statutes, fines, confiscation of the offending garment, were occasionally applied, but not consistently or systematically. What the Tudor period produced was not compliance. It produced negotiation, a constant, low-level social contest between the legal prohibition and the human desire to look expensive. The court records of the period occasionally document specific cases: a London merchant fined for wearing a velvet doublet above his legal station, a provincial gentleman whose wife appeared at a public gathering in cloth of gold reserved for the nobility. But these cases are scattered and inconsistent. They suggest a system that was aware of violations, but incapable of addressing them systematically. The fines, when applied, were rarely ruinous. The confiscation of a garment, when it occurred, was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe for someone wealthy enough to have purchased a prohibited fabric in the first place. The law threatened more than it could deliver. Elizabeth I approached this contest with more sophistication than her predecessors. Her sumptuary proclamations, issued regularly throughout her reign, were precise, detailed, and accompanied by serious statements about the importance of compliance. She understood what her predecessors had not fully grasped, that sumptuary law was as much about communication as about enforcement. The proclamation itself was the message. It stated, publicly and formally, that the social hierarchy was real, that the crown took it seriously, and that violations were noticed even when they were not prosecuted. This created a form of social pressure that operated even in the absence of consistent enforcement. Elizabeth's sumptuary laws were repealed in 1604, 1 year after her death. The parliament that repealed them did not argue that the laws were unjust. They argued that the laws were unenforceable, and that unenforced laws were worse than no laws, because they created the impression that the law could be ignored without consequence. 267 years of fabric legislation in England ended not with a philosophical rejection of the principle, but with a practical admission that the principle could not be made to stick. People were going to wear what they wanted to wear. The law was simply going to have to accept that. The laws that succeeded. Not every sumptuary system failed. Japan's feudal sumptuary laws, enforced during the Edo period between 1603 and 1868, represent perhaps the most comprehensive and effectively implemented clothing legislation in history. The Tokugawa shogunate that governed Japan during this period maintained a rigid four-tier social hierarchy. Samurai at the top, followed by farmers, then artisans, then merchants at the bottom. This hierarchy posed a specific problem. Merchants, despite occupying the lowest formal social rank, were often the wealthiest people in Japanese society. They handled money, moved goods, accumulated capital, and they wanted to spend it on clothing, on the silks and fine fabrics and elaborate decorative garments that the samurai class wore as markers of their superiority. The shogunate responded with sumptuary legislation of extraordinary specificity. Merchants were prohibited from wearing silk. They were restricted to cotton and linen. The colors available to them were limited to subdued tones, brown, gray, dark blue. Elaborate patterns were prohibited. Visible decoration was prohibited. The merchant class responded with ingenuity that the laws had not anticipated. Unable to display wealth on the outside of their garments, they began commissioning extraordinarily expensive silk linings for their plain cotton outer robes. The outside of the garment complied with the law. The inside was lined with the finest silk available, dyed in brilliant colors, decorated with elaborate scenes and patterns. When they wanted to display their wealth to someone they trusted, they simply opened their robe. The law had controlled the surface. It had not controlled what lay beneath it. The shogunate responded by prohibiting expensive linings. The merchants responded by developing new forms of subtle pattern weaving that were technically within the rules but communicated luxury unmistakably to anyone who knew how to read them. This cycle, restriction, creative response, new restriction, continued throughout the Edo period. The shogunate's response to the lining evasion was to specifically prohibit expensive silk linings. The merchant response was to develop what became known in the Edo period as a specific aesthetic of deliberate understatement. Plain, technically legal exteriors that were cut with extraordinary skill, fitted with precision that only the most expensive tailors could achieve, made from cotton that had been processed, and finished to a quality that the untrained eye could not distinguish from something more costly. Merchants began competing not on the lavishness of their visible clothing, but on the subtlety of it, on the refinement of cut, the precision of fit, the quality of construction that could be perceived only by someone who understood clothing at an expert level. The law had told them they could not be seen to be wealthy. They responded by developing a visual language of wealth that the law could not read. What the Japanese sumptuary system demonstrates is not that the laws succeeded. It is that the desire to communicate wealth and status through clothing is so fundamental to human social behavior that no legal system has ever been able to fully suppress it. It finds a way, every single time. What these laws were really protecting. Sumptuary laws were not, at their core, about clothing. They were about anxiety. Every society that produced sumptuary legislation was a society experiencing rapid change in the distribution of wealth. The laws appear in Rome when new trade routes bring sudden wealth to merchant families. They appear in medieval England when the wool trade creates a class of rich commoners. They appear in feudal Japan when commerce generates wealth for people who are supposed to be at the bottom of the social order. In each case, the legal response is the same. The people at the top of the hierarchy, the people whose position depended on visible markers of superiority, looked down and saw people below them who could now afford those markers, and they used the law to maintain the distinction. The anxiety was not merely aesthetic, it was existential. If a wealthy merchant could wear the same color as a duke, could look the same as a duke, could be mistaken for a duke on a public street, then what exactly was the duke? What made his rank real? What made the hierarchy true? The sumptuary laws answered that question by force. The hierarchy is real because the law says it is real, and the law will make you take off the purple cloak that contradicts it. But force was never a long-term solution, because what the laws could not address was the underlying change that was generating the anxiety. The wealth was real, the merchants had it, the lower ranks were acquiring it, and wealth, once acquired, does not stay quietly in the pocket. It pushes against whatever is trying to contain it. The English Parliament that repealed Elizabeth's sumptuary laws in 1604 understood something that Edward III had not fully grasped in 1337. You cannot legislate the social meaning of cloth indefinitely. Eventually, the social meaning changes. And when it does, the law that was protecting the old meaning becomes an embarrassment. The person who broke the law anyway. It is worth pausing to think about who actually violated these laws. Not in the abstract, not as a category of social behavior, but as a specific human decision made by a specific person on a specific morning. A merchant's wife in London in 1475 is getting dressed. She has a gown. It is made of a deep crimson silk that her husband purchased from a Venetian trader at considerable expense. Under the current sumptuary legislation, she is not permitted to wear it. The color and fabric place it above her legal station. She knows this. The law has been publicly proclaimed. The restrictions have been read from pulpits. The penalties are theoretically clear. She puts the gown on anyway. What is she thinking? The historical record gives us no direct answer. We have the legislation. We have the occasional enforcement record. We do not have the inner life of the woman who decided the crimson silk was worth the risk. But we can make reasonable inferences. She is probably calculating correctly that enforcement is inconsistent, that the chances of a justice of the peace interrupting a dinner to inspect her gown are low, that the fine, if it comes, will be manageable, that the social signal the gown sends to her husband's business partners, to the neighbors, to the community that forms her social world, is worth the theoretical legal exposure. She is also, in some sense, participating in the slow erosion of the law itself. Because every merchant's wife who wears the crimson gown and faces no consequence makes it slightly easier for the next merchant's wife to do the same, and the next, and the one after that. The law erodes not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulated small decisions made by individuals who weighed the risk and decided it was acceptable. This is how most sumptuary laws actually died. Not through repeal, not through philosophical rejection, through the quiet, persistent, undramatic act of ordinary people getting dressed in the morning and choosing what they actually wanted to wear. The law could not be everywhere. The people were. The laws that echo today. The last formal sumptuary law in England was repealed in 1604. But sumptuary legislation did not disappear from the world. It transformed. Military dress codes are sumptuary law. They specify in precise legal terms exactly what a person of each rank may wear, what insignia they may display, what colors and materials and decorations belong to which position. The reasoning is identical to medieval sumptuary law. Rank must be visually legible, and the law will enforce that legibility. Professional dress requirements, the barrister's wig, the judge's robes, the requirement that certain officials appear in specified ceremonial dress, are sumptuary law. They restrict what people may wear in specific contexts and attach legal consequences to violations. School uniform laws, in jurisdictions where they are legally mandated rather than merely institutional policy, are sumptuary law. They restrict clothing by the legal category of the person wearing it, in this case, a student. And in several countries, religious dress legislation, both laws requiring certain garments and laws prohibiting them, continues to govern what people may and may not wear in public. The form has changed, the principle has not. The law has always believed it had something to say about what you put on your body. It has just changed its mind several times about what exactly it wanted to say. The medieval sumptuary laws wanted to say, you are what the hierarchy says you are, and your clothing will confirm it. The military dress codes say, you are your rank and your rank will be visible. The religious dress legislation says, you are a member of this community or you are not, and the law will make that visible too. The language changes, the impulse does not. Because the impulse is not really about clothing. It is about the persistent human belief that the social order is fragile. That without visible markers, without some external enforceable sign of where everyone stands, the structure will become unreadable. And an unreadable structure is an unstable one. The medieval merchant who wore the duke's color was not, in most cases, attempting to claim the duke's power. He was just cold and he could afford the coat. But the law could not permit that explanation, because the law had built a world in which the coat meant something that could not be allowed to become available to everyone. And when the coat finally did become available to everyone, when industrial production made luxury fabric accessible across the social spectrum, the sumptuary laws did not survive the transition. They could not, because you cannot pass a law to protect a meaning that the world has decided to abandon. Edward I tried. Henry VII tried. Elizabeth I tried. The merchant kept buying the coat. Eventually, the law stopped arguing. This wasn't myth. It was law.